She signed the divorce papers on a Tuesday morning, and 4 days later, she was someone else's bride. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the man she left behind was about to inherit something that would change the entire world as they knew it. Marcus Ellington had always believed that love was supposed to be the kind of thing that held when everything else fell apart. He had believed it the way a man believes in gravity, not because he chose to, but because life had taught him nothing different. He grew up in a row house on the south side of Atlanta, where the paint on the shutters peeled in long, quiet strips every summer, and where his mother kept a Bible on the kitchen counter next to the dish soap, because she said both things had the power to clean what the world got dirty. Marcus had been raised to work hard, to keep his word, and to love deeply. He had done all three, and for a long time he thought it was enough. He met Vanessa Caldwell at a college mixer in the fall of his junior year at Morehouse. She walked in wearing a burnt orange dress that looked like it had been made, specifically to catch the light of that particular evening, and Marcus, who was standing by the punch bowl pretending not to be bored, felt something shift in his chest the way the earth shifts before a tremor. He didn't walk over to her right away. He wasn't that kind of man. He watched her laugh with her friends, watched the way she threw her head back when something genuinely struck her as funny, watched the way she pushed her braids over one shoulder when she was listening to someone speak. He thought, with the quiet certainty of a man who doesn't yet understand what certainty costs, that she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. They talked for 3 hours that night, about everything and nothing, about their families, their ambitions, their fears. Marcus told her he wanted to build something real, not just a career, but a legacy. Something that would mean something after he was gone. Vanessa told him she admired that. She said the men she'd grown up around talked a lot about legacy, but spent most of their time running from responsibility. Marcus laughed and said he understood that, but that he intended to be different. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and said, "I believe you." And that was the beginning. They dated through the rest of college and into their mid-20s. Marcus worked in commercial real estate, starting at the bottom of a small, black-owned firm in Atlanta called Meridian Property Group, doing site assessments and running numbers for senior agents, who sometimes forgot to credit him in meetings. He didn't complain. He learned, he saved. He studied the market the way some men study scripture, with reverence and obsession. Vanessa worked in event planning, building her own small company that handled corporate functions and private celebrations across the city. They were both grinding, both building, both convinced that the foundation they were laying together would one day hold something magnificent. They got married at a small ceremony in Piedmont Park on a Saturday in June, 5 years after that first mixer. The sky was the kind of blue that makes everything below it look like a painting. Their families were there, laughing and crying in the way only black families can, where the joy and the grief of the past and the present all exist in the same breath. Marcus's mother, Eleanor, held Vanessa's hands before the ceremony and told her that her son had a good heart, but that good hearts needed tending. Vanessa smiled and said she knew. She said she was ready. For the first 3 years, things were beautiful. Marcus got a promotion. Vanessa landed a contract with a major Atlanta hotel chain for their annual corporate events. They bought a house in Cascade, a neighborhood with wide streets and old trees and the kind of quiet that felt like it had been earned. They talked about children. They talked about travel. They talked about the future with the easy confidence of people who have not yet been tested by it. Then the market shifted. In the 4th year of their marriage, a combination of rising interest rates, a wave of corporate portfolio liquidations, and the slow contraction of mid-tier commercial real estate hit Meridian Property Group in ways that the firm's leadership had not anticipated and could not contain. Projects stalled. Clients pulled out. The company began shedding staff in quiet rounds that were dressed up as restructuring, but that everyone understood to be something closer to collapse. Marcus was not laid off. He was, in the language of the firm's exit paperwork, transitioned out due to market realignment. He was 31 years old and he was out of work. He didn't panic. That was the thing about Marcus that people who didn't know him, well, always misread as coldness. He didn't panic because panic wasn't useful, and he had learned from a very young age that you couldn't afford to spend your energy on things that weren't useful. He updated his resume. He reached out to every contact he had. He enrolled in an online certification program for commercial property, development that he paid for out of their savings account, because he believed that this moment, as hard as it was also an opportunity to reposition himself at a higher level. He told Vanessa all of this. He was transparent. He was committed. He believed she understood, but something was changing in her. He could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure. Before a storm, not in anyone, thing she said or did, but in the accumulation of small moments that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. The way she stopped asking about his job search after the 3rd month. The way she began taking her calls in the other room. The way she started spending more time with her friends from college, women whose husbands had the kind of careers that produced certain conversations about vacations and investments that Vanessa had once found pretentious, but now seemed to find aspirational. He noticed. He didn't say anything yet because he was still hoping he was wrong. He was not wrong. Her name came up for the first time in a conversation they had on a Thursday evening in October, 8 months into his unemployment. They were eating dinner Vanessa had cooked, which in itself felt like a performance of normalcy. Neither of them fully believed in it, and she mentioned, too casually, that she had run into Desmond Whitfield at a charity gala she had organized the previous weekend. Desmond Whitfield. Marcus knew the name. Everyone in their social circle knew the name. Desmond Whitfield was the kind of man whose presence in a room shifted the gravitational center of it. He had grown up in the same Decatur neighborhood as Vanessa, had gone to the same high school, had reportedly had a thing with Vanessa for a few months during their senior year before he left for Stanford on a full scholarship and Vanessa went to Spelman, and they both went their separate ways, or so the story went. Desmond had since become one of the most prominent young real estate developers in the Southeast. His firm, Whitfield Capital Group, had been featured in Forbes, in Black Enterprise, in every magazine that tracked the architecture of black wealth in America. He was 34 years old, unmarried, and reportedly worth somewhere between $40 and $60 million, depending on which publication you believed and how conservatively his assets were being valued. He was, by every metric that the world they moved in recognized and rewarded, a success. Marcus put down his fork and looked at his wife. "How was it?" he asked, seeing him again. Vanessa shrugged in a way that was trying very hard to be casual and not quite succeeding. "It was fine," she said. "He looked good. He asked about you." Marcus nodded slowly. "What did you tell him?" She met his eyes for just a moment before looking back at her plate. "I told him you were between things." Between things. Not that he was repositioning himself. Not that he was studying, building, planning. Between things. Like he was furniture waiting to be moved. He didn't sleep well that night. He lay in the dark beside his wife and listened to her breathing, even out into sleep, and thought about what it meant to be between things. He thought about the house they'd built, and the life they were supposed to be building, and the way she'd said those 2 words with the particular flatness of someone who has already, in the privacy of their own mind, decided something. The months that followed were not loud. That was what he would tell his best friend, Darius Webb, later, looking back. He would say that the marriage didn't end in a fight or an explosion. It ended in a series of silences so practiced and so precise that by the time Vanessa finally sat down across from him at the kitchen table on a Monday morning in February, with an expression on her face that was composed in the way that only grief or relief can compose a person's face, he was not surprised. He was devastated, but he was not surprised. She said she needed to be honest with him. She said she had been doing a lot of thinking. She said that she loved him, that she had always loved him, but that she didn't think love was enough to sustain something that had lost its direction. She said she needed a partner who was moving, not standing still. She said she deserved more than what they currently had. She did not say Desmond Whitfield's name. She didn't have to. The name sat in the room between them as clearly as if she had written it on the wall. Marcus listened to all of it. He listened without interrupting, without raising his voice, without doing any of the things that the rage, building quietly inside him, wanted him to do. When she was finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked one question. He asked, "Is this really about the money?" And Vanessa looked at him with an expression that was some complicated. mixture of guilt and certainty, and said, "It's about what the money represents." Then she slid the divorce papers across the table. He signed them. Not because he didn't love her, not because he had given up. He signed them because he understood in that moment that some things could not be held by force, and that trying to hold them that way only made the damage worse. He signed them because he was Marcus Ellington, and Marcus Ellington had always known the difference between a fight worth having and a wound worth surviving. The papers were filed on a Tuesday. On Saturday, his phone lit up with a notification from a mutual friend's Instagram story. Vanessa Caldwell, she had already reverted to her maiden name in the caption, was standing in a garden somewhere, wearing white, laughing beside Desmond Whitfield, who was in a cream linen suit and had the particular expression of a man who has gotten exactly what he wanted. The caption said, "To new beginnings." 4 days. It had been 4 days. Marcus sat with his phone in his hand for a long time. He sat in the same chair where he had signed the papers, in the same house that was now only his, in the same silence that had been growing around him for months. He thought about what his mother had told him when he was a boy, the piece of wisdom she returned to whenever life felt like it was undoing itself. She used to say, "Baby, God don't waste nothing." Not the pain, not the waiting, not the long nights. He's building something. You just can't see it yet. Marcus put down his phone. He looked out the window at the Atlanta sky, still winter pale and wide. He breathed. He didn't know what was coming. He had no way of knowing. But something in him, the deep, quiet, unbreakable part that his mother had built and his father's absence, had tempered and Morehouse had sharpened and every year of grinding had polished. Something in him held. He didn't know it yet, but 5 days from now, a phone call would come that would rewrite everything. A name he barely recognized would carry news, so staggering that the world he was currently sitting in, the stripped-down, humbling, painful world of the recently divorced and recently unemployed, would cease to exist. He didn't know it yet, but the ground beneath his story was already shifting, and what was coming was not just wealth. It was the kind of reckoning that only history and God and the long patience of a bloodline can produce. The phone call came on a Friday morning, and it came from a number Marcus didn't recognize, an out-of-state area code. 843, which he would later learn belonged to Charleston, South Carolina. He almost didn't answer it. He was in the middle of his morning routine, the disciplined structure he had built around himself, like scaffolding since Vanessa left, because structure was the thing that kept a man from dissolving when everything around him had gone liquid. He was up at 5:30, coffee by 6. 2 miles on the treadmill, he'd moved into the second bedroom, then a shower, then 3 hours of focused work on his development portfolio and job applications before the rest of the world fully woke up. It was a routine built not from inspiration, but from survival, the kind of thing a man constructs when he needs to prove to himself daily that he is still standing. The phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. While he was pouring his second cup of coffee, he looked at the number, didn't recognize it, and for a moment considered letting it go to voicemail. He had been getting calls lately from numbers he didn't recognize, creditors, mostly working their way through the edges of what the marriage had left behind in its accounting, and he had developed a reflex of caution around unknown numbers. But something made him pick it up. He couldn't have explained it then, and he wouldn't be able to explain it later either, except to say that it felt, in the way that certain moments do, like a door rather than a wall. "Is this Marcus Ellington?" The voice on the other end was a man's voice, older, professional, measured in the precise way that lawyers and doctors learn to be measured, the cadence of someone accustomed to delivering information that changes the shape of a person's life and who has learned, over decades, to do it with care. "Speaking," Marcus said. There was a brief pause, and then the man said, "My name is Reginald Hargrove. I'm a senior partner at Hargrove, Banks & Tate, a law firm based in Charleston. I'm calling because I need to speak with you about the estate of Solomon Ellington. I understand he was your great-uncle." Marcus set down his coffee cup. He did it slowly, the way you move when the air in a room has suddenly changed, and you're not yet sure what the change means. Solomon Ellington. The name moved through him like something from a dream he couldn't quite place. He knew the name, but only barely. Only the way you know the names of relatives who exist. at the outermost edges of a family's story. Names mentioned in passing at holiday dinners, attached to brief and incomplete histories that the adults seemed reluctant to fully tell. His father's family had been fractured in ways that were never entirely explained to Marcus growing up. His father, Jerome Ellington, had left when Marcus was 6, and the connection to that side of the family had always been fragmented, partial, a constellation with most of its stars missing. He remembered once when he was about 12, asking his mother about his father's side of the family. Eleanor had paused over the stove and said, careful and measured, that Jerome came from complicated people, that there was a great-uncle somewhere in the family, his grandfather's older brother, who had been a businessman of some kind, who had moved away from Georgia decades ago and had, by the accounts that filtered back, done very well for himself. She said the family had lost touch with him. She said some rifts took on a life of their own. She hadn't said his name, or if she had, Marcus hadn't held on to it. He had been 12, and 12-year-old boys are not yet equipped to understand that the names adults don't say are often the most important ones. I'm aware of him, Marcus said carefully into the phone. But I didn't know him personally. We weren't in contact. I understand, Reginald Hargrove said. That's actually not uncommon in situations like this. Mr. Solomon, Ellington passed away 3 weeks ago, at the age of 91 at his home in Charleston. He had been in declining health for some time. He did not have children of his own, and his estate, which is quite substantial, passed through several rounds of legal review before arriving at you as the primary heir. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He could hear the refrigerator humming across the kitchen. He could hear, distantly, a car moving through the street outside. How substantial? He asked because he was a man who had worked in real estate long, enough to know that the word substantial could mean many different things, and precision was always better than approximation. There was a pause on the other end, not uncomfortable but deliberate. The kind of pause a man takes when he's choosing his words, carefully, not because he's hiding anything, but because what he's about to say is the kind of thing that deserves to land cleanly. Mr. Ellington, Reginald Hargrove said, Solomon Ellington's estate has been assessed at a value of approximately $900 billion. The majority of that value is held in real estate, commercial properties, undeveloped land, mixed-use holdings, and several legacy assets that have appreciated significantly over the past 5 decades. There are also equity positions in several private companies and a considerable portfolio of historical property rights that are currently the subject of several very favorable legal determinations. He paused again. You are the sole primary heir. We need you to come to Charleston. Marcus did not speak for a long time. He stood in his kitchen in Atlanta, in the house that was too quiet now, in the life that had been stripped back to its bones, and he listened to the silence on the other end of the phone and tried to find somewhere inside himself to put what he had just heard. $900 billion. The number didn't feel real. It didn't have the texture of reality. It felt like something from a story. Not his story, someone else's. The kind of story people talked about in disbelief at barbershops and dinner tables, shaking their heads at the improbability of it. Not this, not him. I'm going to need some time to process this, he said finally, because it was the truest thing he could say. Of course, Hargrove said gently, but I would ask that you come to Charleston as soon as is practical. There are documents to be reviewed, filings to be made, and several parties with legitimate questions about the estate, whose timelines are governed by legal deadlines. I can have a car sent to you if that would be helpful. All expenses covered, naturally. There was something in the way he said naturally. Not arrogant, not condescending, but with the quiet authority of someone who has long since made peace with the fact that certain things, at certain scales, simply operate differently. I'll drive myself, Marcus said. He didn't know exactly why he said it that way, except that some part of him needed, in that moment, to approach whatever was coming under his own power. He called Darius first. Darius Webb had been his closest friend since their first year at Morehouse, a broad-shouldered, sharp-minded man from Savannah, who now ran his own financial consulting firm and who had the particular gift of being someone you could tell anything to, without it changing the shape of the relationship. Darius answered on the second ring. Already in motion, Marcus could hear the background noise of his downtown Atlanta office, keyboards and low voices and the ambient hum of a working day. "Talk to me," Darius said, which was how he always answered Marcus's calls. Marcus told him everything. The phone call, the name, the number. When he finished, there was a silence on Darius's end that was rare. Darius was not a man given to silence. Then, "Say that number again." Marcus said it again. Another silence. Then Darius let out a long, slow breath and said, "Brother, you need a lawyer." "A real one. Not the kind you call for a speeding ticket. I'm talking about the kind whose firm has been around longer than some governments." Marcus said he understood. Darius said he'd make some calls. He said before he hung up, "Don't tell anybody else yet. Not one soul. You hear me?" Marcus said he heard him. He packed a bag that afternoon. Enough for a week, though he didn't know how long he'd be gone. He moved through the house with the practiced efficiency of a man who has recently learned to live lightly, folding shirts with the kind of care you apply to things. When you've been reminded that things can go, he paused once in the hallway, at the place on the wall where a photograph used to hang. He and Vanessa at a rooftop party, the summer before everything changed. Both of them laughing at something off camera. Both of them impossibly young in the way that people always look in photographs taken before loss. The photograph was gone now, removed in that first week when removing things felt like a form of control. There was a pale rectangle on the wall where it had been, slightly less faded than the paint around it. He looked at it for a moment, then kept moving. He left Atlanta before sunrise the next morning. The drive to Charleston was a little over 4 hours, east on I-20 and then northeast through the low country, and Marcus drove it with the windows cracked despite the February cold. Because he needed the air, the rawness of it, the sense of being in motion through something real. He drove through the long flat stretches of South Carolina as the sky lightened, from black to deep blue to the particular gray-pink of a winter coastal dawn, and he thought about Solomon Ellington. He tried to construct the man from the fragments he had. His grandfather, Walter Ellington, had been a carpenter in Macon, Georgia. Walter had an older brother named Solomon, born sometime in the 1930s, who had left Georgia as a young man, under circumstances the family had never fully clarified. Some accounts said there had been a dispute over land, over money, over something that matters the way only family things can matter, which is to say absolutely and forever. Some said Solomon had simply left because he was the kind of man who left, restless and visionary and unwilling, to be contained by the world he'd been born into, what was known, or what could be reconstructed from the fragments, was that Solomon Ellington had gone to Charleston in his early 20s and had begun acquiring property. This was the 1950s and 60s, a period when black men who moved with intelligence and audacity and the right connections could sometimes find ways into markets that weren't supposed to be open to them. Solomon, by the account that was beginning to take shape in Marcus's mind, had been one of those men. He had apparently possessed a combination of vision, patience, and strategic genius that allowed him to identify land and property in South Carolina, Georgia, and eventually across the Southeast that others had undervalued or overlooked. He had bought it quietly, held it long, and let time do what time does to good real estate, which is to make it worth more than almost anyone who originally sold it could have imagined. He had done this for 5 decades. 5 decades of buying, holding, developing, and waiting. 5 decades of building an empire, so quietly that almost no one outside the circle of lawyers and bankers who managed it had any idea of its true scale. He had apparently given modestly to various causes, historically black colleges, community land trusts in the Low Country, a few churches, but he had never sought publicity. He had lived, by all accounts, in the same house in Charleston for 40 years, a historic property in the Harleston Village neighborhood that was worth more than most people's entire net worth, but that Solomon Ellington had treated as simply the place he came home to at the end of the day. He had, apparently, been a private man in the most profound sense of the word. Not reclusive, not antisocial, but private. A man who understood that the most powerful things are often the quietest ones. And he had left it all to Marcus, a man he had apparently watched from a distance for years, without ever making contact. A man who had spent the last several months being the kind of broke that makes you feel invisible, A man whose wife had just left him for someone richer and was already 4 days into her next marriage. That man. This inheritance was going to land in that man's life. Marcus pulled into Charleston just before 10 in the morning and drove through the city slowly, taking it in. It was his first time there, and it struck him immediately as a city layered with history in a way that was both beautiful and heavy. The pastel-painted houses of the historic district, the harbor in the distance, the enormous live oaks draped in Spanish, moss that lined certain streets like something from a painting. It was also a city whose beauty sat directly on top of an extraordinarily painful past. And Marcus felt that as he drove, felt it in the way that Black Americans often feel the history of beautiful southern places, with a complicated mixture of recognition and resistance and something close to grief. The offices of Hargrove, Banks and Tate were in a restored building on Broad Street, elegant and quiet, with dark wood paneling and oil paintings and the particular atmosphere of a place that has been taking its work seriously for a very long time. A young woman met Marcus at the door and led him to a conference room where Reginald Hargrove was waiting, a tall, silver-haired black man in his late 60s, wearing a charcoal suit and silver cufflinks, who stood when Marcus entered and extended his hand with the firm, warm grip of someone who has been expecting this meeting for a while and is genuinely glad it has finally arrived. "Mr. Ellington," he said, "thank you for coming. Please sit down." He gestured to a chair at the head of the conference table, and Marcus noticed as he took it that the table was covered with files and folders and documents, arranged with the careful organization of months of preparation. He noticed a thick manila envelope in the center of the table with his name on it. He noticed a framed photograph at the far end of the conference room, positioned on a side table near the window, a photograph of an older black man, distinguished and sharp-eyed, standing in front of a building that Marcus would later learn was one of Solomon's first major acquisitions in downtown Charleston. The man in the photograph was looking directly at the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile, but that contained, somewhere in it, something that Marcus could only describe as satisfaction. The satisfaction of a man who has built something true. Reginald Hargrove followed Marcus's gaze to the photograph. "That's Solomon," he said simply. "Taken in 1987, he was in his 50s then, already worth more than most people will ever understand, and still somehow the most unassuming man I have ever known." He paused. "I was his attorney for 31 years. I knew him better than almost anyone." He sat down across from Marcus and folded his hands on the table. "And I can tell you," he said, "that in all the years I knew him, the one thing he talked about most, the one thing he cared about with a consistency that nothing else could match, was making sure that when he was gone, what he had built went somewhere worthy, to someone who would understand what it meant." He looked at Marcus steadily. "He chose you a long time ago. He watched you, more carefully than you know." Marcus looked at the photograph. He looked at the man who had changed his life without ever speaking a word to him, and he felt something move through him that he could not name precisely. Not joy, not relief, not triumph, though all of those things were present in it. It was something older and deeper, something that felt like the answer to a question he had been asking since before he knew. He was asking it. He reached for the envelope with his name on it. He opened it slowly, and he began to read. The documents inside the envelope were 43 pages long, and Marcus read every single one of them without stopping, without looking up, without doing anything, except turning pages and absorbing the weight of what was written on them, because he understood instinctively that this was not the kind of thing you skimmed, not the kind of thing you handed off to someone else to summarize for you, not the kind of thing you approached with anything less than your full and complete attention. Reginald Hargrove sat across from him in the quiet of that conference room and let him read, refilling Marcus's water glass once without comment, and otherwise simply waiting with the patient stillness of a man who has learned that certain moments require witnesses more than they require participants. The picture that emerged from those 43 pages was staggering in its scope and meticulous in its construction. Solomon Ellington had begun acquiring property in the Charleston area in 1958, at the age of 26, with a down payment of $4,000 that he had saved over 3 years of working 2 jobs, days at a shipping company along the waterfront and evenings at a hotel downtown, where he washed dishes and eventually managed the kitchen supply inventory with an efficiency that the hotel's owner, a white man named Beaumont Cates, had recognized and quietly rewarded with a salary increase and, more significantly, with an introduction to a banker named Alton Greer, who had a reputation for doing business with people that other bankers in Charleston in 1958 would not sit down with. That introduction had been the key that opened the first door. And Solomon Ellington, once he had a door open, was not the kind of man who let it close behind him. His first purchase was a parcel of land on the outskirts of what would later become one of Charleston's most developed commercial corridors, land that in 1958 was considered marginal, poorly positioned, not worth serious investment by the people, who considered themselves serious investors. Solomon paid $6,200 for it and held it for 11 years before selling a portion of it at a profit that allowed him to make 3 additional acquisitions simultaneously. He reinvested everything. He lived modestly, drove a used car, ate at home, wore the same suits for years, and channeled every dollar he made back into the portfolio with a discipline that bordered on monastic. By 1975, he owned 17 properties across South Carolina. By 1985, the portfolio had expanded into Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia, with a particular concentration in underdeveloped coastal and near-coastal land that Solomon had identified, with extraordinary foresight, as the kind of real estate that would become dramatically more valuable as American demographics shifted and coastal living became not just desirable, but aspirational at a national scale. He had also, in those years, made several equity investments in private companies that his legal and banking relationships had given him access to, small stakes, carefully chosen, in businesses that were at early stages and that Solomon's instincts had identified as possessing the kind of fundamentals that survive long enough to become large. Several of those investments had grown into companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars. One of them, a logistics firm based in Savannah, that he had invested in during the early 1990s, had been acquired by a national conglomerate in 2019 for a sum that alone represented more wealth than most people encounter in a lifetime of imagination. And through all of it, Solomon Ellington had remained invisible, not by accident and not entirely by choice, but by design, a design that Marcus, reading through the documents, began to understand with a clarity that felt almost like communion with a man he had never met. Solomon had understood. With the hard-won wisdom of a black man who had built wealth in the American South across 6 decades, that visibility was a liability. That the moment you became known, you became a target for scrutiny, for resentment, for the particular hostility that has always shadowed black prosperity in America, the hostility that dresses itself in 100 different costumes, but that is always underneath the same ancient and ugly thing. Solomon had built his empire in the shadows not because he was ashamed of it, but because he was protecting it. And he had protected it so well that even the people closest to him, even his attorney of 31 years, did not know the full scope of it until the estate was formally assessed after his death. The assessment had taken 3 weeks and had required a team of 14 specialists, real estate appraisers, financial analysts, legal experts in property rights and estate law, and 2 forensic accountants to complete. Their conclusion, arrived at independently and then cross-referenced across multiple methodologies, was that the total value of Solomon Ellington's estate was $897 billion, rounded in the official documents to $900 billion for the purposes of public filing. It was a number so large that it sat outside the normal boundaries of comprehension, the way certain distances in space sit outside the normal boundaries of comprehension. You could read the number, you could say the number, but the actual meaning of it, the lived texture of what it represented, required a different kind of reckoning than the mind could perform in an afternoon. Marcus set down the last page of the documents and looked up. Hargrove was watching him with an expression that was careful and steady and kind. "Do you have questions?" he asked. Marcus thought about that for a moment. He had 10,000 questions. He also understood that most of them could not be answered in this room on this day, that what this day required was not answers, but orientation, the slow, deliberate process of locating himself in a new landscape. "Tell me about him," Marcus said. "Not the estate, him. Tell me who he was." Hargrove was quiet for a moment, and then he nodded, as though this was the right question, the question he had been hoping Marcus would ask. He leaned back in his chair and looked toward the window, where the Charleston winter light came through in long, pale slabs, and he began to talk. He talked for almost an hour. He told Marcus about a man who read voraciously and widely history, economics, philosophy, poetry, and who kept a library in his home that visitors, on the rare occasions they were invited in, invariably described as the most impressive private collection they had ever seen. He told Marcus about a man who cooked his own meals and grew tomatoes and collard greens in a garden behind his house, and who could talk about soil composition and crop rotation with the same fluency and passion that he brought to discussions of property law and market cycles. He told Marcus about a man who was quietly and consistently generous, in ways that he insisted never be attached to his name. Contributions to legal defense funds, to scholarship programs at HBCUs, to organizations working on land, reclamation for black families across the rural South who had lost property through the kinds of legal mechanisms that history has documented in painful detail. He told Marcus about a man who had, at various points in his life, been offered partnerships with some of the largest real estate firms in the country and who had declined every one of them, not out of stubbornness but out of a conviction that what he was building needed to remain under his control and under his terms, because he had watched too many black businessmen enter partnerships with larger white-owned entities and emerge with less than they had brought in. And he told Marcus about the decision to choose him. This was the part that sat heaviest, the part that required the most careful telling. Solomon had apparently been watching Marcus since Marcus was in college. He had learned of his existence through a private inquiry he had made into the family he had left behind in Georgia, an inquiry prompted, Hargrove said, by Solomon's declining health in his early 80s and his growing awareness that the question of succession could not be deferred indefinitely. He had hired a researcher to trace the family lines, to identify the living descendants of his brother Walter's children, and to compile profiles on them. There were 7 candidates in that initial research, cousins, second cousins, various branches of the Ellington family that had scattered across Georgia, Tennessee, and Florida over the decades. Solomon had reviewed the profiles with the same careful attention he brought to every important decision, and he had, over a period of months, narrowed his focus to Marcus. Not because Marcus was the wealthiest or the most professionally prominent. He wasn't, at the time. But because of something in the profile that had struck Solomon as significant and that he had discussed with Hargrove in one of their last long conversations before. Solomon's health made sustained conversation difficult. What Solomon had identified in Marcus, Hargrove said, was a quality he called structural integrity. It was a term Solomon apparently borrowed from engineering but used to describe something he believed he recognized in certain people of a fundamental soundness, a quality of being built correctly at the core level, such that even under significant pressure and stress, the person does not collapse into something unrecognizable. He had seen it, Hargrove said, in the arc of Marcus's career, the way he had started at the bottom of Meridian Property Group and learned without complaint, the way he had invested in his own education continually, the way he had handled the firm's collapse without public bitterness or visible deterioration. He had even seen it, Hargrove said quietly, in the way Marcus had handled his divorce. Solomon had known about the divorce. He had known about Vanessa, about Desmond Whitfield, about the humiliation of it, and he had watched Marcus absorb all of it without breaking, without betraying the kind of bitterness that corrodes a person from the inside, without losing the essential dignity that had apparently been visible in him from the beginning. He said, Hargrove told Marcus, in a voice that was careful and deliberate, that a man who keeps his character when everything else is taken from him is the only kind of man who should be trusted with something this large. He paused. Those were his words. Almost exactly. Marcus was quiet for a long time after that. He looked at the photograph of Solomon again, that sharp, satisfied gaze, that expression of a man who has built something true, and he felt, for the first time since Tuesday morning, when he had signed his name on those divorce papers, something that was not grief, not anger, not the hollow endurance that had been sustaining him for months. He felt quietly and powerfully like himself, like the version of himself that had always existed underneath everything that had been piling on top of him. Like the ground was still there. Hargrove suggested they break for the day and resume in the morning, with the more technical aspects of the transfer, the legal filings, the financial structures, the team of advisors that the estate had already assembled, and that would need to be formally introduced to Marcus and integrated into whatever framework he chose to govern, his stewardship of the inheritance. Marcus agreed. He was driven to a hotel, not the flashiest in Charleston, but elegant and quiet, a converted historic property in the French Quarter, neighborhood where a suite had been reserved for him, indefinitely, at the estate's expense. He stood in the suite for a long moment after the door closed behind the bellman, looking out the window at the harbor, at the water moving in the late afternoon light, at the city that his great-uncle had chosen as the place to build something that the world would eventually have to reckon with. He called his mother. Eleanor picked up on the first ring, the way she always did when she knew it was him, because she had a feeling, she always said, when her children needed to talk. He told her everything. She was quiet through most of it, asking only small, clarifying questions, in the careful way she had when she was processing something large. When he finished, there was a long silence, and then he heard her cry. Not dramatically. Eleanor Ellington was not a dramatic woman. Quietly, the way a person cries, when they are overwhelmed, not by sadness, but by the sudden and total confirmation of something they have believed for a very long time without having the evidence to prove it. "Baby," she said when she had steadied herself. "Baby, I told you. I told you God doesn't waste the waiting." He said he remembered. She said, "Come see me when you're done down there. Come home first." He promised he would. He ordered food from room service and ate at the small table by the window, watching the harbor darken as the sun set. He thought about Solomon, the man in the photograph, the man who had grown tomatoes and built an empire and chosen his heir the way a master architect chooses a load-bearing element, with precision and confidence and an understanding of what the whole structure requires. He thought about what it meant to be chosen, not from luck, not from proximity, not from the accident of being in the right place at a fortuitous moment, but from observation, from being seen over years by someone who understood what they were looking at. There was something in that, he thought, that was more valuable than any dollar amount. There was something in that that felt like an argument, a long, patient, irrefutable argument against every narrative that had been trying to define him over the past year. The narrative that said he was broke, that said he was stuck, that said he was the kind of man a woman left for someone more successful, that said he was between things. Solomon Ellington had watched Marcus for years and had reached a different conclusion. And Solomon Ellington had been right about real estate values consistently for 5 decades. That night, Marcus slept for the first time in months, without waking in the dark at 3 in the morning with his heart running fast and his mind already sorting through problems. He slept deeply and completely, the way a man sleeps when the ground beneath him has been confirmed. He didn't dream, or if he did, he didn't remember the dreams. He only knew, when he woke in the gray Charleston morning to the sound of harbor, birds outside the window, that something had settled in him, something permanent, something that had always been there but that had needed this, needed all of it, the loss and the humiliation and the stripping away, to become fully visible, even to himself. He showered and dressed and went back to Broad Street. There was work to do. There was a legacy to understand and then, carefully and correctly, to continue. And Marcus Ellington, the man who had been described as between things, was ready to begin. But Atlanta was watching, and Atlanta had no idea what was coming, because the news of the inheritance would not stay quiet. Not in a world connected the way this one was. Not in the circles that Marcus and Vanessa and Desmond Whitfield all moved in. Not in a city where information traveled faster than light, and arrived with the force of something that had been compressed for a very long time before it was finally released. The quiet would last exactly as long as the legal filings took to become public record. And once it became public record, the world that had made certain assumptions about Marcus Ellington, The world that had watched him sign those papers and lose that house and be described as between things was going to have to do something that worlds like that find very difficult. It was going to have to reckon. The news broke on a Wednesday, and it broke the way certain truths break. Not with the slow, deliberate unfolding of something that has been carefully prepared for public consumption, but with the sudden, violent rupture of something that has been under pressure for too long and has finally found its point of least resistance. It broke in the way that Atlanta news always breaks, which is to say it started in the circles, closest to the center, and moved outward in concentric waves of increasing velocity, picking up distortion and embellishment and the particular electricity that accompanies information that nobody was supposed to have, but everybody somehow does. The legal filings had become public record at 9:17 on a Tuesday morning, buried in the routine intake of the Charleston County Probate Court's electronic filing system, unremarkable among dozens of other estate documents processed that day by clerks, who had no idea what they were handling. The filing listed the name of the deceased, the name of the primary heir, and the assessed value of the estate in the flat, affectless language of legal documentation, a language specifically designed to drain the drama out of facts that, in any other context, would be extraordinary. But someone, it was never entirely established who, though suspicion eventually settled on a paralegal in a competing Charleston law firm who had a cousin in Buckhead, who had a gift for arbitrage and information. Someone had seen the filing before it disappeared into the archive, and that someone had understood immediately what they were looking at, and that someone had made a phone call. By Thursday morning, the story was on 3 Atlanta gossip blogs that specialized in black, professional life in the city, the kind of blogs whose readership included every person who mattered in the particular ecosystem that Marcus and Vanessa and Desmond Whitfield inhabited. By Thursday afternoon, it had been picked up by a local news affiliate that framed it as a human interest segment. Local Atlanta man inherits historic fortune from reclusive South Carolina businessman, and ran a brief report at the 5 o'clock hour that was careful with facts but breathless in tone, the way local news always is, when it senses that a story has more weight than it can fully lift. By Thursday evening, it had reached Black Twitter, which is to say it had reached approximately 7 million people simultaneously, each of whom processed it, through their own particular framework of aspiration and recognition and the complicated emotion that Black Americans have historically brought to stories of extraordinary black wealth, which is some mixture of pride and hunger and the quiet, persistent wonder of watching one of your own break through a ceiling that was built specifically to hold. Marcus learned that it had gone public from Darius, who called at 6:47 Thursday morning, before Marcus had finished his first cup of coffee in the Charleston hotel suite that had become, over the past week, a kind of command center for the initial phase of the estate transfer. Darius's voice had a particular quality to it that Marcus recognized immediately, the quality of a man who is trying to be measured and is not entirely succeeding. "It's out," Darius said. "Don't check your phone yet. Just listen to me first." Marcus set down his coffee cup with the careful deliberateness that had become his default response to moments of sudden turbulence. He had learned in the past week that the scale of what he had inherited required a corresponding scale of composure, that every moment he spent reactive was a moment he was not spending strategic. "Tell me," he said. Darius told him. The blogs, the news segment, the social media cascade, the fact that Marcus's name was now attached, in the public consciousness of a significant portion of Black Atlanta, to a number that had the particular power to reorganize everything that number touched. The fact that Marcus's phone, once Darius finished talking and Marcus finally looked at it, contained 47 missed calls, 63 text messages, and a number of voicemail notifications that the phone's interface had stopped counting at some point in the early hours of the morning and had simply listed as multiple. Among the calls, Marcus noticed, were numbers he recognized and numbers he didn't. He noticed the name of a cousin he hadn't spoken to in 4 years. He noticed the name of a former colleague from Meridian Property Group, who had never once called him during the 8 months of his unemployment. He noticed, at the bottom of the call log, obscured beneath the volume of everything else, a number he had not expected to see. Vanessa's number. He looked at it for a long moment. He did not call it back. He put the phone face down on the table, picked up his coffee, and resumed the morning. The team assembled at Hargrove. Banks and Tate that day was larger than the one Marcus had met in his first days in Charleston. Reginald Hargrove had expanded the working group to include a public relations specialist named Claudette Osei, a sharp, precise woman in her early 50s who had spent 2 decades managing communications for high-net-worth clients, and who had, apparently, been retained by the estate months ago in anticipation of exactly this moment, the moment when the story became too large to be managed by silence, alone, and required something more active, more deliberate. Claudette had cropped natural hair, reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, and the particular manner of someone who has seen enough chaos to have stopped being frightened by it and has learned instead to move through it with the calm efficiency of someone solving a familiar problem. She spread a single sheet of paper on the conference table in front of Marcus. On it were 3 columns. The first was labeled Confirmed Outreach, organizations, institutions, and individuals that had already made formal contact with the estate's legal team, seeking to discuss philanthropic partnerships, investment opportunities, or, in several cases, business propositions whose specifics varied widely but whose underlying logic was consistent. They had identified the new center of gravity, and they were, each in their own way, attempting to position themselves in relation to it. The second column was labeled Media Requests, the number of outlets, ranging from local Atlanta television to 2 major national newspapers to 3 financial publications of international reach that had filed formal requests for comment or interview. The third column was labeled Personal Contacts and contained a list that Marcus read slowly, his expression unchanged, absorbing the names with the same careful attention he had brought to the estate documents a week ago. The list included relatives, former colleagues, friends from various seasons of his life. One name near the bottom of the list, added, Claudette noted, that morning was listed as Whitfield Capital Group, requesting a meeting to discuss potential joint ventures. Marcus looked at that name for a moment. He thought about a cream linen suit. He thought about a caption that said "To New Beginnings." He thought about a woman who had looked at him across a kitchen table and told him that it was about what the money represents. He looked at the name for exactly as long as he needed to, and then he moved his eyes to the next item on the list. "What's our posture?" he asked Claudette. She appreciated the question. He could tell by the slight adjustment in her expression, the way a professional registers the moment when a client demonstrates that they understand the nature of the conversation they're in. "Controlled emergence," she said. "You don't go silent. That creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled with whatever other people decide to pour into them. But you don't overexpose either, not at this stage. You make one statement, measured, personal, forward-looking. You give just enough to confirm the fact and establish the frame. And then you let the work speak." She paused. "The statement needs to come from you, in your voice, not the estate's voice." Marcus nodded. "I'll write it myself," he said. She nodded back, and something in her expression said that this, too, was the right answer. He wrote it that evening, alone in the hotel suite with the harbor lights coming through the window. He went through 11 drafts. He rejected the ones that sounded grateful in the diminishing way, the ones that leaned too heavily on the miraculous nature of what had happened, as though the primary thing the world needed to understand was that Marcus Ellington had been surprised. He rejected the ones that sounded triumphant, that had even a trace of the told-you-so energy that he could feel. If he was honest with himself, somewhere in the periphery of his emotions, waiting to be acknowledged. He rejected anything that mentioned Vanessa or Desmond or the divorce, because that was not his story to tell publicly, and because giving it oxygen was giving it power that it did not deserve. He wrote and discarded and wrote again, and what he arrived at, after 11 drafts and 3 hours, was something short enough to read in 45 seconds and simple, enough to mean exactly what it said. He wrote, "I am the grandnephew of Solomon Ellington, a man who spent 60 years building something extraordinary in the quiet and the patience that true building requires. I am still learning who he was and what he understood. What I know already is that I intend to honor what he built not by holding it, but by continuing it, by using what he left behind to create something that extends his vision forward. I am a man from Atlanta, from the South Side, from a row house where my mother kept a Bible next to the dish soap, because she said both things could clean what the world got dirty. I am that man still. The number that has been attached to my name changes many things. It does not change that. Claudette read it the next morning and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't change a word." It went out through the estate's communications channel at 10 o'clock on a Friday morning, and by noon it had been shared 40,000 times. And by evening it had been quoted in full by two of the publications that had filed media requests, each of which had apparently recognized, with the instincts of organizations that traffic in language for a living, that the statement contained something that resisted the usual frameworks for talking about sudden wealth, something that was neither humble in the performative sense nor proud in the defensive sense, but simply true in the way that very few public statements manage to be true. The response from Atlanta was something Marcus could only observe from a distance, receiving it in fragments through Darius's updates and the small window that his carefully managed social media presence provided. He watched as the story moved through his city, the way stories move through cities, picking up the texture of wherever it touched, being shaped by the particular needs and projections of each person who encountered it. He watched as people who had known him at Morehouse posted memories of him with the particular energy of people retroactively confirming what they had always believed. He watched as strangers built narratives around him that were partly accurate and mostly aspirational, stories about what his inheritance meant for Black Atlanta, for Black wealth more broadly, for every person who had ever been told they were between things and had refused to believe that between things was a destination. He understood that he was becoming, whether he wanted to or not, a symbol. He understood that symbols serve functions that individual people cannot control, that once a story reaches a certain scale, it begins to belong, in some real sense, to everyone who needs it. He held that understanding with care, neither rejecting it nor surrendering to it, trying to maintain the thread that connected the symbol to the actual man, the man who still called his mother every other day, the man who still made his own coffee, the man who still, in the mornings before the day got loud, sat with the estate documents and the legal briefs and the financial analyses with the same focused attention he had brought to site assessments at the bottom of Meridian Property Group, because he understood that what Solomon had built required understanding before it could be continued, and understanding required time and rigor and the willingness to learn what you don't know. What Marcus was learning in those early weeks in Charleston was vast and complex and humbling in the way that true scope always is. The estate was not simply large, it was intricate. Solomon had structured it over decades with a legal and financial sophistication that reflected not just the quality of his advisors, but the quality of his own thinking. There were holding companies and trusts and shell entities and property rights, structures that had been layered with the careful precision of a man who understood that wealth at this scale exists in a legal and regulatory landscape that is constantly in motion, and that surviving in that landscape requires architecture that can flex without breaking. There were properties whose value was not simply in their current use, but in the underlying rights. They carried mineral rights, air rights, historical easements that had accrued significance over time as the land around them had developed. There were equity positions in companies that were still growing, still in the process of becoming whatever they were going to become, whose value at the moment of assessment was real but not yet final. The full picture was not a photograph. It was a process. Marcus worked with the team of advisors that the estate had pre-assembled, 6 people, each an expert in a different dimension of what he had inherited, each accustomed to operating at a scale that most of their professional peers never encountered. There was a real estate attorney named Bernard Ash who had the particular gift of being able to explain extraordinarily complex legal structures in language that was precise without being inaccessible, and who, Marcus noticed, never once condescended or simplified in the way that some experts do when they sense they are talking to someone who is still learning the landscape. There was a financial strategist named Priya Chandrasekaran who had spent 20 years managing multi-billion-dollar portfolios and who had a way of talking about market cycles that made them feel like weather, not unpredictable, Exactly, but natural. Governed by patterns that rewarded attention and punished complacency. There was a legacy and philanthropy consultant named Amos Trent, a 60-year-old black man from Columbia, South Carolina, who had spent his career working at the intersection of black wealth and community investment, and who carried in his work the particular moral seriousness of someone who understood that money at this scale was not just a personal resource, but a civic one. It was Amos who introduced Marcus, in their second week of working together, to the concept that would eventually become the organizing principle of everything. Marcus would build. He didn't present it as a concept. He presented it as a question. He asked Marcus, in the middle of an otherwise technical discussion about the estate's existing philanthropic commitments, what he thought Solomon had been building toward. Not what Solomon had built, what he had been building toward. The distinction was deliberate, and Marcus sat with it for a moment before answering. He said he thought Solomon had been building toward permanence, toward something that would outlast him, that would continue to operate and grow and give after he was gone. Amos nodded slowly. And what does permanence look like, he asked. When you're talking about wealth at this scale, in a community that has historically been denied the conditions necessary for wealth to accumulate and persist? Marcus was quiet for a long time after that question. He was quiet for long enough that Amos seemed to understand that the silence was productive and let it run its course. When Marcus finally spoke, what he said was not an answer but a direction, a way of orienting himself toward the question that would take months to fully articulate and years to fully build. He said, it looks like infrastructure. Not charity, infrastructure. Amos leaned forward slightly. Tell me what you mean by that. And Marcus, the man from the south side of Atlanta, who had grown up understanding that the difference between a neighborhood that worked and a neighborhood that didn't was rarely a matter of the people in it, and almost always a matter of the resources available to them, began to speak. He spoke about land, about ownership, about the specific ways in which black communities had been separated from land ownership across American history, and about the specific ways in which land ownership, more than almost any other single variable, determined the conditions under which wealth could accumulate across generations. He spoke about what Solomon had understood, that land, held long and managed correctly, was the most durable form of wealth that existed, and that the communities that had been systematically deprived of it were not deficient, they were divested. And he said that what Solomon's estate, in the hands of someone who understood all of this, could do was not simply give. Giving was a transaction. Giving was a moment. Giving was a photograph. But build. Build the conditions. Build the infrastructure. Create the pathways through which wealth could begin to accumulate in communities where it had been extracted for generations, and then protect those pathways with the kind of legal and financial architecture that Solomon himself had used to protect his own. Amos was quiet for a moment after Marcus finished. Then he looked at Hargrove, who was sitting at the other end of the table, with an expression that was carefully neutral, but that contained, if you were paying attention, the very faintest suggestion of a smile. He sounds, Amos said to Hargrove, like Solomon. Hargrove looked at Marcus steadily. Yes, he said. He does. Marcus called his mother that night, as he did every other night, and he told her about the conversation. Eleanor listened in the way she always listened, which was completely not waiting to respond, not formulating her next thought while he was still speaking, but actually receiving what he was saying in the full and attentive way that only certain people are capable of. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Baby, can I tell you something?" He said, "Of course." She said, "When you were about 8 years old, you used to build these little towns in the backyard, out of whatever you could find, rocks and sticks and those plastic containers. Your grandmother used to save. You'd spend hours on them. And one time I asked you what you were building, and you looked at me like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And you said, a place where people can stay. Mama," she paused, "you've been building the same thing your whole life. You just finally have the materials." Marcus stood at the window of the hotel suite, looking at the harbor, at the water that had been here before the city and would be here after it, at the particular darkness of a winter, coastal night that was not empty, but full, full of distance and possibility and the patient accumulation of time. He thought about 8-year-old Marcus building towns in the backyard. He thought about Solomon Ellington at 26, with $4,000 and a door that had been cracked open just wide enough for a man of sufficient vision and sufficient will to push through. He thought about Eleanor keeping her Bible next to the dish soap, because both things could clean what the world got dirty. He thought about structural integrity. He thought about what it meant to be built correctly at the core level, such that even under significant pressure and stress, the person did not collapse into something unrecognizable. He was not unrecognizable. He was, if anything, more himself than he had been in years. The layers of compromise and quiet desperation, and the low-grade grief of a marriage deteriorating and a career stalling, having been stripped away to reveal what had always been underneath. A man who knew how to build, who had always known how to build, who had simply been waiting, without knowing he was waiting for the materials. The materials were here now. The work was beginning. And Atlanta, the city that had watched him sign those papers and lose that house and be described as between things, was going to see what a man who had been built correctly at the core level could construct when the weight of $900 billion was placed in his hands, and he chose, deliberately and with full awareness of what he was doing, not to spend it but to continue it, not to consume what Solomon had made, to become worthy of it. That was the decision Marcus Ellington made in a Charleston hotel room in the last days of February, listening to his mother's voice on the phone and looking at the dark water of the harbor outside. That was the decision that would govern everything that came after. Not how to use the money, how to become the person the money required. He didn't know yet everything that would be required of him. He didn't know yet how difficult some of it would be, or how many people would arrive in the months to come with their hands out or their agendas, concealed or their old relationships, reconstituted in new shapes designed for a new reality. He didn't know yet how Vanessa's phone call would eventually be returned, and what that conversation would contain and what it would clarify. He didn't know yet what Desmond Whitfield would eventually do. Not ask, not reach out through intermediaries, but actually do, when it became clear that the landscape had shifted in ways that his particular kind of ambition could not ignore. He didn't know any of that yet. He only knew that the ground was confirmed, that the work was real, and that somewhere in the archive of a Charleston probate court, a document existed that contained, among its 43 pages of legal language and financial assessments and property descriptions, the name Marcus Ellington listed as the sole primary heir of Solomon Ellington's estate. And that document was now public record. And public record, unlike a lot of things in this world, did not change. The reckoning Atlanta had been postponing was no longer postponable. And Marcus Ellington, the man who had once been described as between things, was now the one thing no one in his world had seen coming. He was ready. The first person to arrive uninvited was a cousin Marcus hadn't seen in 6 years. His name was Terrence Ellington, Jerome's brother's son, which made him Marcus's first cousin on the father's side, a connection that had always been technically accurate and practically non-existent, in the way that certain family relationships are, the ones that exist on paper and at funerals and nowhere else in between. Terrence was 34, lived in Stone Mountain, and had, in the years since Marcus had last seen him at their grandmother's burial, worked a series of jobs that he described in different ways depending on who was asking. Logistics, he sometimes said, or consulting or deals, the vagueness of the description functioning as its own kind of information. He was not a bad man. Marcus didn't think he was a bad man. He was simply the kind of man who had learned early that proximity to the right person at the right moment was its own form of strategy, and who had, upon reading the news about his cousin's inheritance, recalibrated his definition of the right person with a speed that Marcus found more clarifying than hurtful. Terrence showed up at the Charleston Hotel on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced, having apparently obtained the name of the property through the same informal intelligence network that seemed to have no difficulty locating Marcus's whereabouts, despite the fact that Marcus had shared them with almost no one. He was dressed carefully, art new shoes, a blazer that still had the particular stiffness of something recently purchased, and he had the particular energy of someone who has rehearsed what he is going to say and is managing, with moderate success, the gap between the rehearsed version and the live one. The front desk called Marcus's room to announce him. Marcus sat with the phone for a moment, looking out at the harbor. Then he told the front desk to send him up. They sat across from each other in the suite's living area, and Terrence talked for 20 minutes about family and legacy and blood connection and the importance of taking care of one's own. And Marcus listened to all of it with the same careful, complete attention he brought to everything these days, because he had decided early in this process that listening without reacting was not passivity but information gathering, and information was what he needed most right now. When Terrence had finished the prepared portion of what he had come to say and had arrived at the pass framed not as a request for money but as a proposal for a business partnership, a logistics venture that needed seed funding and that Terrence believed, with the specific enthusiasm of someone who needs to believe it, would be transformative. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he asked Terrence 3 questions. He asked what the venture's current revenue was. He asked what the legal structure of the existing entity was. He asked what Terrence's specific operational role would be in the proposed partnership. Terrence's answers to all 3 questions were, in different ways, incomplete. Marcus nodded. He said he had a team now, and that any business proposal would need to go through that team, and that the team had a formal intake process, and that he would make sure Terrence had the contact information before he left. He said this without coldness and without apology. He said it the way a man says something that is both true and final. Terrence left 2 hours later with the intake contact information and the particular expression of someone who had expected a different conversation and was still processing the one he'd actually had. Marcus stood at the window after the elevator doors closed and thought about his mother's advice, delivered the previous week in her careful way. Baby, the same blood that runs through your veins runs through a lot of people who didn't go through what you went through to earn what you now have. Love them, but don't let love be a mechanism. He had held that sentence since she said it. He understood it more clearly now. Terrence was the first. He was not the last. Over the following 3 weeks, as Marcus continued the work of understanding and formally assuming stewardship of the estate, the arrivals continued, with the patient regularity of a tide, each one slightly different in its approach, in its framing, in the relationship it claimed as its basis for access, and each one fundamentally similar in its underlying logic, which was the logic of proximity to extraordinary wealth and the human impulse, which Marcus had decided to view with compassion rather than contempt, to try to find a way inside that proximity. There were relatives. There were former colleagues, including 2 men from Meridian Property Group whose names Marcus remembered from meetings where they had received credit for his work. There were people from his Morehouse years who framed their outreach in the language of old friendship and whose messages, read carefully, contained within them specific financial propositions dressed in the clothes of nostalgia. There were people he had never met at all who had found, through the various channels that the internet makes available to determined people, ways to reach his phone or his email or, in 3 cases, the estate's formal correspondence address, with proposals that ranged from the earnest to the absurd. Marcus developed a practice for managing all of it that was rooted in something. Amos Trent had told him in one of their early sessions together. Amos had said, "The hardest thing about wealth at this scale is not the complexity of the decisions. It's the clarity required to see who is in front of you. Because everyone who comes to you will come with a story, and most stories are true, at least in part. The question is not whether the story is true. The question is whether you are the appropriate response to that story." Marcus had written that last sentence in the notebook he now carried everywhere, the one in which he was assembling, page by page, the framework for what he intended to build. He returned to it often. He found that it served, in most situations involving the management of access and requests, as a reliable guide. He also found, as the weeks progressed and the initial wave of arrivals began to settle into a pattern, that his ability to read people had sharpened in ways that surprised even him. The experience of the past year, the long, slow unraveling of his marriage, the months of watching Vanessa's withdrawal through the fine grain of small moments had apparently recalibrated something in him, had tuned some instrument of perception that had previously been operating at a coarser resolution. He could now read with uncomfortable accuracy the difference between someone who was genuinely glad for him and someone who was glad for what he represented to them. The difference was not always visible in what people said. It was visible in the timing, in the lag between the moment the news broke and the moment the outreach came, in whether a person mentioned his name before they mentioned the number. Darius, who drove down from Atlanta on a Saturday in early March to spend the weekend and who sat with Marcus over whiskey and low country, take out and spoke with the blunt, loving directness that had always been the foundation of their friendship. Put it more plainly. He said, "You know what tells you everything? Whether they called you before this?" He let that sit. Because some people did. Your mother, me, old Professor Watkins from Morehouse, who sends you a text every year on your birthday and never asks for anything. That's the circle. Everybody else is auditioning. Marcus thought about that framing. Auditioning. He decided it was useful. He decided he would be a fair but rigorous audience. The work with the estate's advisory team continued in parallel with all of this, moving forward with the steady, purposeful momentum of something that had been in preparation for a long time and was now finally in motion. Marcus spent his mornings with Bernard, Ash reviewing the legal architecture of the estate's major holdings, developing a working fluency with the structures that Solomon had built and that Marcus would need to understand, not just superficially but at the level of mechanism, the level at which decisions about modification or expansion or divestiture could be made with the confidence that came from genuine comprehension rather than delegated expertise. He had a principle about this that he had articulated to Hargrove early in their work together. He would rely on experts. He would trust experts. He would compensate experts generously for their knowledge, but he would never make a decision based on expertise he did not himself understand well enough to evaluate. That was Solomon's model, Hargrove had confirmed. Solomon had never signed anything he couldn't explain in his own words. His afternoons were typically spent with Priya, working through the financial portfolio, the equity positions, the private company stakes, the cash and liquid asset holdings that formed the operational reserve of the estate. Priya had a gift for translating complexity into principle, and the principle she returned to most frequently, across many different specific discussions, was the principle of time horizon. She said that most people, when they came into significant wealth, immediately shortened their time horizon. They began thinking in quarters, in years in the near term, because the near term was where the wealth was most visible and most immediately responsive to decision. She said Solomon had done the opposite. She said Solomon had thought in decades, always, and that thinking in decades was what had allowed him to make decisions that looked counterintuitive in the short term and indisputable in retrospect. She asked Marcus what his time horizon was. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "Generational." She nodded. She said that was the right answer and also the hardest one, because generational time horizons required a specific kind of patience that was difficult to maintain in a world that rewarded speed and punished waiting. Marcus said he had some experience with waiting. Priya looked at him over the rim of her glasses and said she'd read the statement he had released. And yes, she suspected he did. It was in the third week of March that the conversation Marcus had been anticipating, the one he had been allowing to exist, unaddressed at the edge of his awareness since the missed call appeared in his phone. Log finally happened. It happened because Marcus decided to make it happen, which was itself a decision that he had arrived at carefully. After reflection, after talking it through with Darius and in a different register with Amos, whose counsel on the human dimensions of what Marcus was navigating had become something Marcus valued more than he had initially expected to. He called Vanessa on a Tuesday evening. He called from the hotel suite, standing at the window, as he tended to do when he was doing something that required him to be grounded in the present moment, and in the particular quality of light on water that had, over these weeks in Charleston, become his version of his mother's Bible next to the dish soap. The phone rang 3 times. On the 4th ring, she answered. Her voice, when she said his name, contained something he had not expected. He had prepared himself for several things. For the performance of casualness, for guilt masquerading as warmth, for the specific register of someone trying to reposition themselves in relation to a changed reality while pretending the repositioning is something else. What he had not prepared for was the rawness in it. She said his name, Marcus, and in the single word there was something that was not performing anything. It was just a voice. Her voice. The voice of the woman he had loved for a decade and married in Piedmont Park on a blue Saturday in June and lost, in stages over the long, slow dissolution of a marriage that had not survived the particular tests that life had decided to apply to it. "I got your call," he said. There was a pause. "I wasn't sure you would call back," she said. He said, "I wasn't sure either." Another pause. Then she said, in a voice that was smaller than any voice he had heard from her in years, smaller than the voice she had used at the kitchen table with the divorce papers between them, smaller than the voice that had said it was about what the money represents. She said, "I owe you an apology. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know you know that too. But I needed to say it. I needed you to hear me say it." Marcus was quiet. The harbor outside was dark. The lights of the city strung along the waters, edge in the particular way that lit cities look from a distance, like something decorative rather than functional, like something designed for looking at rather than living in. He thought about everything he could say. He thought about the kitchen table and the divorce papers and the cream linen suit and the caption that said "To New Beginnings." He thought about what it cost a person to say they were wrong, and whether the cost was real or whether it was inflated by the changed circumstances that had made the apology suddenly convenient. He thought about what Amos had said. The question is not whether the story is true, but whether you are the appropriate response to it. "I hear you," Marcus said. Not "I forgive you." Not "it's fine." Not the absolutions that would have been easier to say and less honest. "I hear you." She was quiet for a moment, and he could tell. He had always been able to tell. It was one of the things about his knowing her that did not dissolve with the marriage, that she was crying. Not dramatically, quietly, in the way a person cries, when they are not asking for anything from the tears except the release of them. "How are you?" she asked after a moment. "I'm working," he said. "I'm learning. I'm building something," she said. "I know. I've been following." He said, "I know you have." A long silence. Then she said, and this was the thing that landed hardest, the thing he would carry with him after he hung up the phone and stood for a long time at the window. "I always knew you were going to be something extraordinary. I just stopped believing it at the wrong time." He thought about that. He thought about the cruelty of timing. The way the same truth told at different moments carries entirely different weight. He thought about Solomon watching him for years, across distance and silence, and arriving at a conclusion that Vanessa had abandoned, when the evidence was temporarily against it. He thought about structural integrity. He thought about what you find out about a person in the moments when the pressure is highest and the ground is least stable. "Take care of yourself, Vanessa," he said. He meant it. He hung up and stood at the window for a long time, not thinking about anything in particular, just being present in the room, in the city, in the particular moment of his life that he was standing in. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel sad. He felt something more complex and more complete than either of those things. He felt the full dimensionality of what had happened to him over the past year, the loss and the stripping away and the slow, grinding humiliation of being described as between things by the person who was supposed to know best what he was. And he felt, moving through all of that like a current through water, the specific quality of confirmation that comes when you have held to something true for a long time without external support, and have finally definitively been proven right. Not by the money, by the man who chose you before the money was known, by Solomon, who had watched and waited and seen through to the core of him and decided, with the confidence of a man who had been right about the long term for 6 decades, that this was the one. The next morning, Marcus met with Amos and Bernard and Priya and told them he was ready to begin the formal process of establishing the entity that would govern his stewardship of the estate. He had a name for it. He had been carrying the name for several days, testing it against the weight of what it needed to carry, and he had decided it was right. He told them the name. They were quiet for a moment. Then Hargrove, who had been sitting at the end of the table as he always was, said it aloud, just the name once, in the measured voice of a man who has spent 31 years learning to speak. Solomon Ellington's vision back to itself? The name sat in the room with the same quiet authority that Solomon's photograph had the first day Marcus had seen it on the side table by the window. The satisfaction of a man who has built something true. The entity would be called the Ellington Foundation for Generational Infrastructure. It would be seeded with an initial capital, commitment drawn from the estate's liquid holdings. Its mandate would be formal, public, and specific: the acquisition, development, and long-term stewardship of land and real property assets in historically underinvested Black communities across the American South, with the explicit goal of creating durable, transferable wealth infrastructure that could persist and compound across generations. It would not be a charity. It would not be a grant-making organization. It would be, as Marcus had said to Amos in their first real conversation, infrastructure, the conditions, the pathways, the architecture that wealth requires in order to become something other than a moment. It would be, in other words, exactly what Solomon Ellington had spent 60 years building for himself, and what Marcus Ellington intended to spend the rest of his life building for everyone who looked like him and had been denied the conditions to build it for themselves. Hargrove drafted the incorporation documents that afternoon. Bernard began the initial filings. Priya began the capital allocation analysis. Amos began the outreach to the first set of community partners, organizations already doing the work on the ground in Atlanta, in Birmingham, in Jackson, in Savannah, in the places where the need was deepest and the existing infrastructure the most fragile. Marcus sat at the conference table and reviewed each document as it came across, reading with the careful attention of a man who understands that the language of a founding document is not procedural but constitutive. It does not describe what something is. It creates what something is, and what it creates persists long after the room where it was created is empty. He thought, as he read, about a row house on the south side of Atlanta, about paint peeling in long, quiet strips in the summer, about a woman keeping a Bible next to the dish soap, because both things had the power to clean what the world got dirty, about an 8-year-old boy building towns in a backyard out of rocks and sticks and plastic containers, building already a place where people could stay, about a man at 26, with $4,000 and one open door and 6 decades of patience, that the world had not known was patience because it had not yet seen what it was patient for, about 2 men, separated by generations and silence, and the particular fractures that family carries across time, who had been building the same thing all along, who had understood, independently and in entirely different circumstances, and across an unbridgeable distance of time and experience, the same foundational truth that the most important things are built slowly and quietly and correctly at the core, and that the measure of what you have built is not what it looks like when you are finished, but what it is still doing when you are gone. The documents were signed before 5 o'clock. The Ellington Foundation for Generational Infrastructure existed. It was real. It was in the world. It was the first thing Marcus Ellington had built with the materials Solomon Ellington had spent a lifetime assembling. It would not be the last. Outside, the Charleston spring was beginning to assert itself, the particular softness that came to the low country in March, the way the light changed quality and the air lost its winter edge, and the harbor took on a color that was somewhere between blue and green, and that looked, in the afternoon, like something that had been painted by someone who understood that beauty and weight are not opposites. Marcus stood at the window one more time, at the end of that day, and looked at the water. He thought about Atlanta, about going home, about what it would mean to return to the city that had watched him fall, carrying what he was now carrying, being what he was now becoming. He thought about the people there who had loved him without condition, and the people who had written him off, and the people who had simply not known what they were looking at. He thought about what it would feel like to walk back into that city as himself, not the broke version, not the humiliated version, not the between-things version, but the actual version, the one Solomon had seen, the one his mother had always known. He was going home soon. There was more work to do in Charleston, more structures to build and filings to complete and partnerships to formalize. But the pull of Atlanta was strong now, stronger than it had been since he left, and he understood that the pull was not about anything as simple as return. It was about the next phase. It was about taking what had been built in the quiet of Charleston and bringing it back to the place where the story had started, the place where the divorce papers had been signed and the Instagram post had landed and the world had made its assumptions about a man who was between things. It was about beginning in the city that thought it knew what had happened to Marcus Ellington. The project of demonstrating exactly what had happened to Marcus Ellington, not as revenge. Marcus had sat with that impulse and examined it honestly, the way Solomon had apparently examined everything, and he had decided that it was not strong enough or clean enough to build on. What he felt was not the desire for revenge. What he felt was the desire for truth, for the full picture, for the story to be complete in the way that only time and action could complete it. He was going to give Atlanta the full picture. He was going to give it the part of the story that hadn't been told yet. He was going to build something in that city that would stand for 100 years, and people would drive past it and tell their children about it, and the children's children would grow up under the shadow of it, without knowing the full story of how it came to be there, only knowing that it was there, only knowing that it endured. And that would be enough. That would be more than enough. That would be exactly what Solomon had always understood was enough. The harbor held its color in the fading light. The spring air moved through the cracked window with the particular gentleness of a season arriving at the right moment. Marcus Ellington, the man from the south side of Atlanta, the man who had been between things, the man who had been chosen by a ghost he had never met and was only now beginning to know, looked at the water and felt, for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember, the specific and irreplaceable feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing, with exactly the materials he had always needed. He was ready to go home. You just watched a man lose everything: his job, his marriage, his dignity. You watched Vanessa look him in the eye at that kitchen table and tell him that love wasn't enough, that he wasn't enough. You watched her sign her name to a new life, 4 days after signing him away, standing in a garden beside the man she chose instead, wearing white, laughing like Marcus Ellington never existed. But here is what Vanessa didn't know, what Desmond didn't know, what nobody in Atlanta saw coming. The man they wrote off was about to become the most powerful man in the room. Every room, any room he walked into, and he was coming back to Atlanta, back to the city that watched him fall, back to the same circles, the same streets, the same people who nodded along when someone said he was between things. In part 2, Marcus Ellington doesn't just return. He returns as something none of them were prepared for. And Vanessa, the woman who sat across that table and slid those papers toward him, like he was already finished, is going to have to look at him again. This time she won't be able to look away. The reckoning isn't coming. It's already here. If you need to see how this ends, hit subscribe. Turn on your notifications, because part 2 drops soon, and I promise you, you do not want to miss the moment Atlanta finally understood exactly who Marcus Ellington was. Subscribe now. The story isn't over. It's just getting started.